Cornille Lecture, sponsored by the Wheatley Institution, is named, obviously, in honor of Truman G. Madsen. As I mentioned, our first senior fellow at the institution and a longtime faculty member here. The lecture is endowed by a generous gift to the institution for this purpose. Truman Madsen's work has served as a model for scholarship that combines the most rigorous intellectual preparation and standards with clear and finely honed understanding of and commitment to the highest spiritual and moral values. He was in all his work and all his life true to the spiritual foundations and the intellectually transformative implications of our religion. We have kept the title of one of his early works, Eternal Man, in this lecture because we believe that recognition of the eternality and therefore the dignity and moral status of the individual human soul is or should be at the core of all of our social institutions, as well as at the core of our understanding of ourselves and what we can become. The preservation of these core social institutions and the articulation and dissemination of core principles of truth and virtue, which provide for the flourishing of the human soul, are essential to the mission and purpose of the Wheatley Institution and BYU, and I think shared with people of good faith and integrity throughout the world. It's our pleasure now to hear from tonight's guest. We're honored that she would come to give this lecture. Catherine Cornille is the Newton College Alumni Chair of Western Culture and a professor of comparative theology at Boston College, specializing in theology of religions and interreligious dialogue. From 2008 to 2013, she organized the Boston College Symposia on Interreligious Dialogue, bringing together scholars from different religions in various parts of the world to focus on fundamental questions of interreligious dialogue. Professor Cornille was the first woman professor in the history of Catholic University of Louvain, where she taught comparative religions and is the first woman to hold the position of chair of theology department at Boston College. She's been bailed out from that responsibility, but the record still stands. Her research interests include the theology of religions and concrete questions in the Hindu Christian and Buddhist Christian dialogues. She's the author of the Possibility of Interreligious Dialogue and Many Mansions, Multiple Religions, Belonging, and Christian Identity. She's the founding and managing editor of the book series Christian Commentaries on Non-Christian Sacred Texts and the editor of the Wiley-Blackwell Companion to Interreligious Dialogue. She holds a licentiate in theology, a BA in philosophy, and a PhD in religious studies from Catholic University of Louvain, as well as an MA in Asian religions from the University of Hawaii. She and her husband, Jeffrey Blokel, I hope I got that name close, have 3 children. And from another source, I have this report of Professor Cornille. It says, being a mother, she says, without her children, she would be a wreck. They help me keep the balance between being a human being and a scholar. We're glad to have you here for both purposes. Professor Cornille.
Thank you very much. I thank the Wheatley Institution for this kind invitation. It's a great honor for me to be here and to deliver this Truman Madsen Lecture this year. I was delighted to hear more about his life and his work, and I think indeed that the topic of this evening resonates very much with his attitude towards the world, towards other religions, and towards fellow human beings. So the title of my lecture this evening is The Limits and Possibility of Interreligious Empathy. Around the time of the centenary anniversary of the World Parliament of Religions in 1993, Hans Küng, a famous Catholic theologian, had the famous words that there would be no peace in the world without peace between religions. There would be no peace between religions without dialogue between religions. And this evening I would like to extend that quote by saying there will be no dialogue between religions without empathy across religions. So I would like to reflect on the concept of interreligious empathy this evening, which is a rather complex topic, difficult to get a hold of, but I believe very important in all forms of interreligious dialogue. You can understand, or dialogue can be understood as a sort of going back and forth between witnessing to the truth of your own religious tradition and empathizing with the life and experience of your dialogue partner. So that's how we, in the world of dialogue, usually see that going back and forth of interreligious dialogue. But empathy itself is a category that has become quite outmoded in some ways in the world of interreligious dialogue and interreligious studies. Partly, I think, because it's such a difficult category to get a hold of. And that's why I find it so fascinating also, and why I would like to dedicate some thoughts to the topic this evening. Why is empathy so important in interreligious dialogue? I can name three important reasons why that aspect of dialogue is so crucial or so central. First, it's an essential dimension of understanding the religious other. In the study of religions, we can study texts, we can dedicate our whole life to studying languages and books and so forth. But religion is not just about ideas and about facts, it's about experiences. So religion ultimately comes out of and is oriented towards experience. So the experiential dimension of religion is absolutely central. And if we want to understand people of other religious traditions, I think it behooves us, or it's important, to try to penetrate that experiential dimension, to try to understand what the impact is of certain beliefs and practices on the lives of individuals belonging to that tradition. So just for the purpose of understanding religious others, I think attempting to penetrate into that experiential dimension is absolutely essential. So a very important cognitive function of empathy. Secondly, I think there's also an ethical or a moral reason for emphasizing the importance of empathy in interreligious dialogue. Empathy is often seen as a violence curber and a peacemaker. So when people want to engage in forms of aggression against the religious other, they will tend to usually dehumanize the other. So empathy is more and more recognized as an important quality that helps people overcome aggression and violence. And if we think about the relationship between religion and the threat of tension and violence between religions, the importance of empathy is or empathy also has a very important ethical or moral function in interreligious understanding. Sometimes it can also be seen as somewhat ambivalent, and in scholarship on empathy, scholars go back and forth between whether empathy is always indeed a moral quality, because empathy, you can also use empathy to torment the other. For example, desecrating the sacred script of another religious tradition is usually based on an understanding of how important that text is for others. So empathy can also be used to torment the religious other. But for the most part, empathy allows people of different religious traditions to develop more sympathy for the religious other and more harmonious relationship with members of other religious traditions. It's also, I think, or what it does is also restore relationships between members of different religious traditions. If we look at the history of religion, that history is really dominated by tensions between religious traditions, by violence between religious traditions, and the act of empathy towards or about the pain that one may have caused members of other religious traditions is an important means to restore relationship between religions. So empathy also has, in that sense, also an important moral function. It's often said that very little has contributed more to overcoming attitudes towards slavery in the United States than Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. Martin Hoffman says this about this: "It is not an exaggeration to say that by humanizing the slaves and exposing their daily pain, the book aroused empathy for them in hundreds of thousands of people worldwide and made a profound contribution to social and cultural change in America." So empathy has that kind of transformative effect. It allows people to understand the pain and the suffering of others and thereby restore relationships between different religious groups. And finally, the importance of empathy in interreligious dialogue is also in light of the fact that interreligious dialogue can also lead to genuine learning and growing through gaining a deeper understanding of other religious traditions. So interreligious dialogue, at least the way I understand it, is not only about learning facts about other religious traditions, but also sometimes learning from other religious traditions. So other religions can sometimes have teachings and practices that can enrich our own self-understanding and our own practice. But we will probably not go as far as learning from the other religious tradition unless we are able to resonate positively with the experiences of the other. So interreligious learning is usually more than just a cognitive matter. It's a matter of experiencing something more or expanding our experiential horizon in a way that we may want to integrate experiences that we have gained in other religious traditions within our own tradition. So that is the constructive role of empathy, how resonating with positive resonance with experiences in another religious tradition can lead to a growth within our own religious tradition. And therefore, for all of these reasons, I think it is important to gain some understanding of how empathy works, to understand a little bit more about the possibilities and the limits of empathy. I first want to say a few things about empathy in general. Curiously, the term empathy is actually of relatively recent origin. It was coined at the end of the 19th century in Germany, originally to denote our aesthetic response or our response to works of art. Then gradually it was used by someone like Theodor Lipps to apply to the understanding of mental states of others. So, of course, that doesn't mean that people did not empathize before the 19th century. Clearly, that's not what's meant here. But if we look at the history of the concept of empathy, there clearly is a stronger and stronger emphasis on empathy with the development of an understanding of the individual, of the human person as an autonomous individual trying to understand the other. There's a famous work by Jeremy Rifkin called The Empathic Civilization, where he offers a grand overview of the development of empathy through time and cultural and intellectual shifts. And he points out that empathy develops really in modern times, in the modern era, mostly with the development of the understanding of the human subject. The advent of perspective in art, perspectivism in philosophy, and introspection in psychology led to further surge in empathic consciousness and eventually to a therapeutic industry based on identification with the feelings and experiences of others. So, of course, as I said, the experience of empathy is of all times and not even limited to human animals. Frans de Waal is a famous scholar who has studied empathy in chimpanzees. But what I'm interested in is the understanding of empathy as an epistemological tool. So empathy as a means of understanding the other, of entering into the experience of the other. So before we go into interreligious empathy, a few more things about empathy in general. So empathy is sometimes confused with sympathy, but they are two distinct categories. Scholars sometimes say that sympathy is empathy plus commitment to the welfare of the other. So sympathy is empathy plus commitment to the welfare of the other. So sympathy has a much more of a social, affective connotation to it, whereas empathy has more of a intellectual, cognitive dimension in the literature on empathy. Sympathy also usually has to do with experiences of pain, loss, suffering, whereas empathy is used for all kinds of experiences of joy and ecstasy, happiness, wonder. All kinds of religious experiences can be probed through empathy. Scholars have also made distinctions now between different types of empathy. There's cognitive and affective empathy, basic and reactive empathy. I won't go into all the details of all the scholarly distinctions here. In general, though, empathy has not only to do with the actual feelings of the other, but can also have to do with an attempt to probe the motivations that drive people to particular actions. One of the first philosophical studies of empathy is by Edith Stein, and Edmund Husserl developed that further in his work, and this is how he defines empathy. I put myself in the place of another subject, and by empathy I grasp what motivates him and how strongly it does so, with what power, and I learn to understand inwardly how he behaves and how he would behave under the influence of such and such motives, determining him with such and such a force. So empathy is not only about the feelings themselves, but also the motivations underlying particular feelings and experiences. Another important aspect of empathy in general in scholarship is that what is not surprising, that it's pointed out that empathy is generally directed mostly to in-groups versus out-groups. So people will empathize more with members of their own clan, of their own race, of their own family versus others. That's also not surprising. They will empathize more with people who are honorable than with people they regard as dishonorable. And finally, a last point about empathy is it is not a female quality. Even though it's often associated with women have more capacity for empathy, scholars generally agree that women, in fact, do not have more capability or capacity for empathy than men do. That the responses of women to questionnaires of empathy often are informed with what they think is expected for them to say in those questionnaires or with external circumstances, but scholarship generally agrees that there's no difference in gender with regard to the possibility of empathy. So these are a few comments on empathy in general. Now, what is interreligious empathy? Here we can make a distinction also between different approaches to empathy in the encounter between religions. In general, interreligious empathy is a matter of transposing oneself into the life world, into the religious context of the other, and attempting to grasp affectively the impact of certain beliefs and practices on the life of the individual. And so transposing oneself into the life of the other and attempting to resonate affectively with the impact of particular teachings and practices on the life of individuals. Now, this can be understood, interreligious empathy can be understood in terms of trying to empathize with a particular individual in another religious tradition. So, of course, as you know, every religion is internally incredibly diverse. Every individual in the LDS Church will have a different experience of the tradition, just as every Catholic will have a different experience of the tradition. So we can understand interreligious empathy as just attempting to put oneself into the experience or into the life of a particular individual of another religious tradition and trying to understand their particular experience of that tradition. That could be one understanding of interreligious empathy. Another understanding can be more generic and be about just oneself resonating with the teachings and practices of another religious tradition as one is trying to understand them on an affective level. So there the focus is not necessarily on a particular individual, but more in the literature that would be called self-focused empathy, trying to be aware of one's own affective resonance or response to the teachings and the practices of another religious tradition one may be studying or trying to understand. So this is a more sort of general understanding of empathy, of personal resonance, in contrast with an attempt to resonate with a particular individual in a particular other religious tradition. Now, empathy does not necessarily have to always be a positive response. So you can empathize with experiences in another religious tradition and have a more negative or critical assessment of them. So empathy does not always lead to appreciation of the other. It can lead to a negative judgment of what you have empathized with in another religious tradition. All of us have a whole register of possible feelings and affective responses to another, or types of understanding of another, and sometimes they can be negative. We can understand the impulse, maybe even effectively, of somebody committing religious forms of terrorism. That doesn't mean that we condone them. And so we can judge negatively experiences that we empathize with. And so maybe this is a good time for us all to think of maybe examples in our own life. I'd like you to think of an example of positive response to an attempt to empathize with the other, and on the other hand, an experience where you have tried to understand empathically what is going on in another religious tradition, but just could not understand what was going on an affective level. I'm sure we all have those kinds of experiences. Sometimes we resonate immediately, have sort of an immediate affective response with what is going on. Sometimes we just have no idea of what the emotional state is of that person in another religious tradition. And I can give you a direct example from my own life. I have studied other religions and particularly Hinduism, indeed, for a very long time. And one of the aspects of Hinduism is a ritual where the god is taken outside of the temple and taken on a tour around the temple. And all the believers are standing around the statue, and suddenly when they see the statue, they're in complete ecstasy. People start dancing and shouting, and there's this moment of energy and ecstasy that I've witnessed many times, but never was able to fully sort of enter into and understand really what the feeling was of the person in question. On the other hand, you know, I've often participated in meditation practices and yoga practices with people from other religious traditions, and there I can slip quite naturally into the kind of world and experience of people practicing this type of religion and resonate quite readily with what is going on. So these are just my examples, but I'd like you to think of your own examples, and then maybe we can have more of a exchange and see whether the conditions for empathy that I will discuss now fit somehow with your own personal experiences. So what I would like to discuss now are what I call four conditions for empathy, or four elements that are part of empathy that both show the possibility and also the limits of interreligious empathy. And the first condition for empathy is sympathy. I was saying that sympathy can be understood as empathy plus care for the welfare of the other, but sympathy is also itself a condition for empathy. So we will only empathize with the other if we have a positive disposition towards the other. If we are a priori critical or negative towards the other, there's very little chance that we will be able to empathize with what is going on in the experience of the other. So sympathy is, I think, a first essential and important condition for empathy. In the history of interreligious understanding also, most scholars have also spoken about that necessity to give yourself fully and lovingly to the object of your study. So that is really always recognized as an important condition for interreligious empathy. However, what is the problem with this condition? The relationship, or the default relationship of one religion towards the other, is mostly negative or critical. Right? Religions, by nature, are in competition with one another, and another religious tradition and its believers will usually be approached from an attitude of suspicion, maybe even hostility, because they proclaim something that threatens my own tradition, that threatens my own belief, that challenges it in ways that can lead to me questioning my own tradition. So these are all reasons why the other religious tradition is usually not approached from a believer's point of view with an attitude of sympathy and openness and generosity. And religions are competitors towards one another, and so sympathy is not the natural attitude towards other religious traditions. However, in the history of religions, we see also that religions can, in time, develop a more open and sympathetic attitude towards other religious traditions. And sometimes as a result of experiences of empathy. Just to give an example from my own Catholic tradition, until Vatican II, this attitude of what we call exclusivism, only my religion is true, all other religions are false, that was the attitude towards other religious traditions until 1965 in the Catholic Church. In the course of the 20th century, though, as theologians came to learn more about other religious traditions and came to learn more about the harm that had been inflicted on other religious traditions as a result of that exclusivism, the attitude towards other religious traditions also came to change in the course of the 20th century. So you can say that a positive attitude is a condition for empathy, but empathy can also create sometimes a positive change in a religion. So it's because of the ability to understand other religious traditions that the Catholic Church slowly came to see or to state that there were elements of truth and goodness in other religious traditions that Christianity could learn from. Yeah, so The attitude towards other religious traditions can change over time, but that is one of the challenges for interreligious empathy, that we don't approach other religious traditions naturally with this attitude of sympathy and acceptance and positivity. I think we have to recognize that as one of the challenges or the limits of interreligious empathy. A second condition for empathy is knowledge and participation. So empathy with members of other religious traditions doesn't replace understanding or study of the tradition, the history, the texts, the languages, the practices. So knowledge of the other religious tradition is a very important dimension of empathy. It's only in understanding the other religious tradition in its distinctiveness and all its internal particularities that we will have a proper empathy with the other religious tradition. It's very easy in interreligious empathy to just project our own self-understanding onto the other. And that tendency to projection is only corrected by careful study of the other religious tradition and understanding its particularities, its differences, its details, and so forth. So knowledge of the other religious tradition and careful study of it is an important aspect of empathy. And that's uncontroversial. Anyone can study another religious tradition. Connected to knowledge of the other religious tradition, though, is participation in the religious life of the other. It's easy to study another religious tradition and think that we understand what is going on. But sometimes participation in their ritual life brings it to life in a completely new and profound and powerful way. For myself, I know that Judaism, for example, is different from Christianity in its understanding of the transcendence of God. But I never experienced it as strongly as when I participated in a Yom Kippur ceremony in the Jewish tradition. So participation in the ritual life of another religious tradition is a very important and powerful stimulus for empathy. It awakens through the smells, the bells, the songs, everything you hear and you see and you smell, all of that awakens a dimension of understanding and resonance with the other that you don't get from simple studying of the other tradition through reading the books and so forth. So participation is a very important dimension. However, the problem with participation is, of course, that religious traditions don't always allow participation from members of other religious traditions. So in the Catholic Church, for example, members of other religious tradition can participate in all of the Mass except for receiving the Eucharist, which is the most sacred dimension of the liturgy in the Catholic Church. So we see that in most religious traditions that there's a possibility for participation except for certain aspects that are most precious, most important for members of that other religious tradition. I think in the LDS Church also non-members are not allowed in the temple. Am I right? So then it becomes difficult indeed to participate and to resonate with a whole array of rituals that take place in the temple and that might allow for more ready resonance with the religious other. So I'm not stating this as a critique, it's just an observation that presents a limit for interreligious empathy and resonance and understanding. So that is the second condition for empathy. The third condition for empathy is experience. Empathy is usually understood as, in philosophy, what the category that is used is that of analogical apperception. We understand the other by analogy to our own experience. So our own experience will always become the basis and the touchstone for understanding the religious other. So we draw on our own experiences of fasting to understand how fasting happens in another religious tradition, our own experience of pilgrimage to understand pilgrimage in another religious tradition, of meditation, of devotional love, and so forth. So our own experience is always the basis for understanding other religious traditions. And here we could get into a whole interesting conversation about whether those experiences are reflective of a kind of universal type of experiential religious experience, or whether each experience in each religion is fundamentally different. There can be a whole debate about that. There can be a debate about whether religious experiences themselves are unique, or whether they're just a more intense form of more universal experiences. Is religious love something distinctive, or is it just a more intense form of human love? There's a debate in the history of philosophy about that. Schleiermacher, for example, believed that there was a distinctive religious experience, namely the experience of ultimate surrender or ultimate dependence. Otto believed that there was a distinctive religious experience that had to do with an experience of awe and fascination and fear of the transcendent, and so on. So is religion something itself completely distinctive, or is it a particular form of more generic human experiences? So if we have in each religious tradition a whole array of experiences that is developed and that we tap into to understand other religious traditions, we can say, if there is an analogy between experiences of different religious traditions, then we can use our own experiences to understand the other. However, our own experiences are also limited by the particularity of our own tradition. So other traditions may develop a whole alternative array of experiences that have no parallels in our own religious tradition. So as far as I can tell, although there is some form of spirit possession also in Christianity, but the church has really not cultivated the experience of spirit possession, which is probably why I have such trouble understanding that experience when it manifests itself in other religious traditions. So religions tend to develop particular types of experiences that sometimes may serve as a basis for understanding others, but sometimes can also inhibit our understanding across religious traditions. On the other hand, many scholars have pointed out that our experiences are not just shaped by our religion. They're also shaped by our class, by our gender, by all kinds of other factors that color our experience and can serve also as a basis for understanding across religious traditions. So sometimes my gender is more important than my religion in understanding, for example, a Muslim woman in particular situations. And then you can start from that aspect to go into the differences in another religious tradition. You see, so the fact that we are all hybrids, that we are all a combination of different influences and aspects can also serve to help us in the process of empathizing with other religious traditions. It also sometimes explains why sometimes it's easier to understand people in another religious tradition than understanding people in our own religious tradition. And that's sort of a common comment that is made in the study of religion, that sometimes monks of one religious tradition have an easier time understanding monks in another religious tradition than they have understanding, a completely different type of religiosity within their own broad religious tradition. So there are types of religious experiences that are analogous across religious tradition that sometimes make it more easier for empathy to occur across religious traditions than within one's own religious tradition. Another experience within Christianity that I have very little resonance with is the experience of born-again Christians, for example, which I have, even though, of course, they are reborn in Christ, and Christ is at the center of my faith also. But what that experience is something that, even as a Christian, I have very little resonance with. So that's another aspect of empathy, that there are types of experience in different religious traditions that sometimes make it easier to understand across religions than within religious traditions. So does that mean that our possibility for empathy is only restricted to what we have already experienced? If we look at the scholarship on empathy, there is no one who claims that our possibility for empathy is only restricted to what we have already experienced. Max Scheler is one of the famous philosophers who has written about empathy, and he says the following. He says, "We have a lively and immediate participation in joy or sorrow, can share with others their appreciation of value, and can even enter into another commiseration for a third party without ever having sampled that particular quality or experience before. A person who has never felt mortal danger can still understand and envisage it, just as he can also share in it." And he gives the example of Jesus suffering and an experience of despair in Gethsemane, noting that it can be understood and shared regardless of our historical, racial, and even human limitation. He states, "And for every candid heart which steeps itself in that desolation it operates, not as a reminder or revival of a personal suffering, great or small, but as a revelation of a new and greater suffering hitherto undreamed of." So, even though we have never experienced the kind of despair that Jesus experienced in Gethsemane, we can still empathize or stretch our imagination and our experience to empathize with that experience in another religious tradition. So what empathy does is it broadens our experiential horizon, it broadens our repertoire of religious experiences just by the attempt to empathize with another religious tradition. And so finally, what is required for the possibility of empathizing with new religious experiences is the imagination. So that is the fourth condition for interreligious empathy is imagination. Imagination is that which fills the gap, you can say, between what you have already experienced and what you are trying to grasp experientially in another religious tradition. So it is through the imagination that you travel into worlds, at least experientially and mentally, unknown and resonate with the religious other. And I think this is really, it's the imagination mostly that makes empathy so difficult to understand and get a hold of. Because imagination is the most elusive of faculties. And there is no philosopher or even theologian who has come up with a final theory of the imagination, how the imagination works, how to control the imagination, and so forth. So this is really, I think, the reason why empathy is so difficult to grasp, because the imagination is so difficult to explain and to get a hold of. On the other hand, we can also use the way in which the imagination works in our own religious tradition to expand it and understand how it can grasp religious worlds different from our own. So the imagination is the faculty that allows us to conceive of possibility, of things being other than they are. That is how the imagination, that is what the imagination is. And the religion is about grasping possibility in itself. It is about imagining things to be other than they are. So the imagination is a primal faculty of every religious tradition. We always imagine things that are unimaginable, that are beyond our present experience and understanding. So religion is about imagination. And I would venture to say that if the particularity of the way our imagination works within our own tradition can also help us conceive of alternatives. If we believe in one ultimate personal reality, that faith or that belief itself, the imagination of that reality, can also allow us to imagine alternatives. So it's the belief in one personal ultimate reality that allows us to imagine multiple ultimate realities. It's the belief in a male God that allows us to imagine the possibility of a female God. It's the belief in the existence of an eternal self that maybe allows us to imagine the possibility of no self. So every concrete imaginary reality presents itself together with alternative possibilities, I would venture to argue. And I think that is what allows us to imagine, if we try to do so, imagine other possibilities and allow us to enter imaginatively in the world of the other. However, the imagination is also uncontrollable. The imagination can also run wild. We can project all kinds of things on the other that are not really there. So the imagination also has to be controlled through participation, through study, and all of the other things that I have mentioned already before. So if we look at all of these conditions then for dialogue, what is missing, though, in all of these elements that I have mentioned is something that I would argue is essential in the experience of the other, namely faith. It is the experience of faith that makes the unimaginable into something that is imaginable. It's the experience of faith that makes the unimaginable into something that is real, even more real than reality itself. And that, I think, is what is missing in every attempt at interreligious empathy. We can try to stretch our imagination. I can try to understand the worship of a Hindu who worships Krishna by analogy to my love of Christ. I can try to understand the love of a Hindu devotee for Krishna by analogy. But what is missing in my understanding of her or him is the faith in Krishna. It's not just faith that is important. It's faith in Krishna that is important for that person in the other tradition. Just as for me, it's not faith, but faith in Jesus Christ. And it's that the person of Jesus Christ is not just an abstract reality. It colors, or Jesus colors my experience, just as Krishna colors his or her experience. And that, I think, is really where the limits of interreligious empathy comes in. So by way of conclusion, what I have sketched, I think, is mostly a list of obstacles for interreligious empathy. So it's difficult. Why? Because of our religious exclusivism that prevents us from having a kind of natural sympathy for the other. It's difficult because of the limits to participation in the ritual life of the other. It's restricted by the particularities of our own personal experiences, and it's limited by the limits of our imagination. So these are all ways in which interreligious empathy can be a real challenge or can be difficult or problematic. And above all, the problem with interreligious empathy is what I just mentioned, the absence of faith, that absence of the internal attitude and focus on the particularity of what the content is, the content is of one's faith. and that colors the experience. So you can say that all of this brings about a kind of salutary attitude of humility, respect, and even awe for the alterity of the other. One of the dangers of interreligious dialogue is that of reducing the other to the same, or else projecting one's own feelings and desires on the other. Recognition of an unbridgeable gulf between oneself and the other provides the space for the other to speak for herself and for the dialogue or conversation with the other to continue. On the other hand, I think the impossibility of complete empathic fusion with the other does not mean that empathic understanding of the other cannot yield important fruit. It can deepen our understanding of the other. It can change negative prejudices towards the other. It can expand one's own religious horizon and one's own experiences, and it can enrich our own religious tradition. So I would argue that interreligious empathy does indeed represents a vital element in the dialogue between religions, in peace between religions, and in peace between the nations. Thank you very much. So I look forward to, there's
a few questions.
Yeah, a microphone in front, and I'd be happy to entertain questions or comments.
Thank you very much. I'm interested in any thoughts you have about the limits and the possibilities of the aesthetic. Ritual, setting, all of these things are profoundly aesthetic. There's so many things about our engagement with God that fosters both participation and the imagination that are profoundly aesthetic. Now, on the one hand, there's a sort of an elusive, it would be easy to say, oh, yeah, it's aesthetic, and so just explain to me what the bells mean, and I'll be fine. I can understand, like I say, some real possibilities of using art and the aesthetic as an entree into the otherness and those sorts of things. On the other hand, maybe we just end up with the same kind of problems you've talked about. So I'm just interested in any thoughts you have about the role of the aesthetic plays in so many modes of worship and that sort of thing.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't think that represents a distinctive challenge or possibility even for empathic understanding. In some ways, every religion has its own aesthetic, and what one religion might regard as particularly beautiful might be regarded as ugly or abide by members of other religious traditions. So aesthetics are also a matter of taste and culture, and may sometimes, in fact, inhibit empathy because of just the alienness of the aesthetics of a particular religious tradition. On the other hand, it's also, again, unpredictable. Some people might find a certain aesthetic in another religious particularly appealing and use that as an entry into another religious tradition. Might find, the simplicity of a Zendo, for example, particularly appealing. I think the more particular a religious aesthetic is, the more difficult in some ways the entry into it. So I often think also of the example of the whole world of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas that are evoked in Mahayana Buddhist sutras. I don't know if any of you have read these, but they begin by evoking this whole heavenly world of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and they're sitting on thrones, and they're all described in all of their details. And it's all so alien to me that it immediately sort of alienates me from what is really going on. So it in fact is an extra challenge to enter into the experience because of all the aesthetic that is evoked. The same with, it's easier, I think, to appreciate a Zendo, the beauty of a Zendo, than to I don't know, maybe appreciate the inside of a Tibetan Buddhist temple with all of the iconography that is all quite alien to us, that we might find beautiful but also off-putting. So that again is such a subjective, I think, element in interreligious dialogue, that it's a bit unpredictable how that may contribute to or inhibit interreligious empathy.
Okay, hi, thank you for your time tonight. I've enjoyed everything. I am a part of the student association of this university, and I don't know how aware you are of our university, but we're pretty homogenous. Naturally, most of the students here are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but we're also pretty homogenous racially, in sexuality, and in socioeconomic status. And so part of my association has been trying to create something like this. We call it Pen Talks, and it's a situation just like this in this sort of a room, but with a panel of students from these minority groups who aren't traditional BYU students, and having a topic that they all discuss, and that everyone, just like this, that everyone's able to submit questions to ask the panel. And so in that sort of a setting, do you have any specific guidelines you think we ought to follow, me as the organizer of the event, in order to encourage empathy and unity and peace?
Thank you. You're talking about interreligious meetings. So I think the most direct conduit for empathy is when people speak about their own religious life and experience. So I can imagine a panel like that where everyone is going to say, this is what my religion believes and this is what we do and so on, in a very sort of theoretical way, in an abstract way, but just, very well intentioned, trying to explain what they believe to others. But that is all sort of very rational and heady. And I think the best conduit to empathy is for these people to speak about their own religious life and experiences. Why, ask them to talk about very important moments in their own religious journey, and explain the challenges and the joys they have in their own religious life and so on. So much more of an element of testimony, mutual testimony, than just explaining the content of one's own religious tradition. That's what I would recommend. Interreligious empathy always needs a face, or having a face is an important means for empathy. But in addition to that, sort of somebody who speaks from the heart about their own experience, because it's really with experiences that one empathizes, and so having them speak from their experiential life, that's what I would recommend. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you as well for your time. My question is, would you share a religious experience to which, say, a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints could empathize with? If you're comfortable, I would love to try to experience this.
Yeah, I would like to hear from you sort of experiences that you have or have not. It's hard for me, being in my place, to talk about what you, being in your place, might be able to empathize with or not. So hearing from you where you find sort of experiences in other religious traditions that you think, this is so far from my religious life, I have no idea what's going on, or, I really resonate with this or that in another tradition.
Sure. Well, for me, my experience has been as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I've grown up in a home that lived the gospel. I've been a pretty obedient person throughout my life, and it's prepared me to try to understand who Heavenly Father is. What am I, a child of God? Has He loved me? And I've approached God in prayer, and and felt an overwhelming feeling of his love. It's kind of like that moment when my firstborn son was born. I loved him the moment he was born, and every day I interact with him. I come to know him more and love him more. And that's kind of been my experience with our Father in heaven. The more I try to love him and think of him and keep those covenants that I made with him, I feel like it builds my understanding of who he is and that relationship. And so there's this element of keeping his commandments while trying to understand that spiritual depth that might be available through knowing our Heavenly Father and, of course, Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm. So, on the basis of that particular focus on and experience, I would imagine that you might have an easier time empathizing with, of course, Jews and Christians, other Christians in the first place, but maybe also with Muslims. So any tradition that has belief in a personal creator God who's in relationship with humans and gives commandments and so on. So all of these elements that are part of your experience, you will have easier time empathizing with also in other religious traditions. But for example, in the Islamic tradition, there's the 99 most beautiful names of God. Love is not one of those names, for example. So we might easily think, well, Muslims and Christians believe in the same God, creator God who gives commandments and so on. But there's something about your relationship to God that's given in your tradition that's probably affectively somewhat different from the way Muslims relate to God, for example. So there you can, by knowledge of all those details, also both empathize with aspects of the other tradition, but also maybe see some differences between the way you experience God and the way a Muslim might experience God. And that then can lead to sort of mutual learning and deeper understanding of one another. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. I love that explanation.
Okay.
I'm going to ask a question. It's strange. I've been sitting there and thinking, for 20 years, I was on a journey with my husband, on this journey that you're talking about, and that these people have been asking questions about, and I thought, I need to say some of it, and I need to ask you a question about it. I think when we began, it was suggested that he used the resources of the chair to go in and learn about other people's religion in the way that you spoke of, with empathy. and to be, well, I think Truman used to talk about it as go to their fire and then bring them to our fire. And so they're where the light is, where the fire is burning, so they feel as much as they can of what's going on. It's a very interesting experience we had in Sweden. We went there, and Christer Stendahl that year had been Truman's teacher, and he welcomed us, and he had a news conference in a Mormon chapel, which said, so much to his people. And he said, we should welcome this new temple they're building here. And then he told, I think you probably have heard this in his 3 rules for interacting with other people and learning about them. First of all, talk to someone who really is an adherent, not to an anti-folk who wants to tell you all the bad stuff. Don't compare your best with their worst. I mean, this is familiar, isn't it, to you?
Yeah.
But he told this to the newsman when Truman was there, sitting there. And I sat there thinking, what kind of respect does a man have and faith of his own that he can just say this to one of his students who was there to talk about building the temple. And the last one is my favorite.
Holy envy.
Holy envy. I love to even say it because for me, the 20 years included holy envy for Muslims that I lived with in Jerusalem, for Jews that I lived with in Jerusalem, and for finding out how alike they were and didn't know it. You know, it was just a unique thing. Their hospitality was the same, and we were coming to the fire to find out about them. My question is, after all of that, I just want you to know that I think I understand what you're talking about. My question is, I think what I learned was that that holy envy was probably the most important, but that I could interact with one person, one-on-one, and by their fruits, I could know them. Not by what they said about their religion, but what they were and what we are. And I remember Ulwiya Husseini, my sweet friend in Jerusalem. She was a devout Muslim, and every time I was with her, when I'd come to her home, she'd fix me anise tea in little cups. And the last time I met her, she was dying. She sent home 2 cups with me to be at home with me so I could have anise tea and remember her. But I always had a pencil and paper with me. She'd quote something from the Quran, and in her context of telling me something, it was her, it was meaningful. So my question is, I think we don't need to worry too much about all those other ways that it doesn't work, but we can think about our one-to-one relationship with people. And in the interfaith group, they can talk to each other one-on-one and be authentic and be respected. And the respecting of others, I think, is the trick. How do you feel about that? The one-on-one, the just learning from someone. You may not know anyone else in their religion, but you know them.
Yeah. Thank you for that, and thank you for sharing. I love that image of the fire. Have them come to our fire and us go to their fire.
Yeah.
That really touches much of what I was trying to say also about that dimension of experiences that is so essential.
I thought it was. I could feel that that's what you were saying, and
That's right.
I've experienced it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. In terms of the one-on-one, I think you're absolutely right that we become religious through our parents or through a particular person, we also enter into another religion, usually through individuals, through people we know and love and respect in other religious traditions. So I completely agree that is indeed the entry into respecting another religious tradition. I think, or the most, as I said before, empathy needs a face. If you see a person who lives their life, their religion in an authentic way, that is what will allow you to resonate with their experience. But I think I want to completely affirm that. But there are other ways in which we can also resonate that are completely unpredictable or unexpected. There are moments where you may wander into a sacred place of another religious tradition and suddenly experience something completely new and different and never have expected it. I think one of the first experiences I had was when I was 22 years old. I came to the United States for the first time, and I was introduced to an American Indian tribe. And everything was new. I had no knowledge of anything or anyone. And the head of the tribe was this very powerful American Indian woman who was speaking from her heart about the connection between humans and nature. I can't recall exactly everything she said, but I had this really powerful experience of sort of certain strings that were played in my own soul, strings or music that I had never heard, or a kind of resonance I had with a dimension of myself that I had never been in touch with. So it can also happen in these kinds of unpredictable, spontaneous ways, or it can happen indeed, as you say, through people who live their life in very authentic ways.
You made me think of the first time I went to a brit. A brit.
Okay.
And, well, for everybody else, it's a circumcision. And the grandfathers were holding the baby. And I opened my eyes when they were praying. And I looked at the grandfather who, when they performed the brit and the baby cries out, the grandfather had tears rolling down both his cheeks. An experience I had never had. I've had the experience of having my baby blessed in the circle of priesthood, and I've had tears going down my cheeks. Mm-hmm. Sabbath, the same. The Jewish Sabbath informs my Sabbath today. Mm-hmm. I mean, I have real holy envy for that feeling mm-hmm. that I always had every Shabbat in Israel. Mm-hmm. A lot of those, I mean, the Jewish weddings, I was in a lot of those, and a lot of Muslim weddings. And all of them were unexpected, like you're saying.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't know I was going to feel like I felt when they stamped on that glass. I thought, no, that's not part of a wedding to step on a glass. I mean, on a goblet. But it was, you know.
Yeah. And would that we could share all those experiences with other people in our traditions that are afraid of the other.
Yes, yes. Well, and don't worry about not being able to go into the temple. Talk to somebody who's been and let them tell you how it feels. Mm-hmm. You don't need to have gone in to know.
Okay, thank you. I think there are a few more questions.
If that's all right.
You have a question?
I do.
Okay, these two, and then we better.
One of the things that struck me particularly during your lecture was you said that interreligious dialogue can lead to not only learning facts about a religious tradition, but learning from other religious traditions. And I wondered if you had a specific powerful example in your life of learning something, experiencing something in another religious tradition that really informed your own religious traditions, your own religious beliefs.
Thank you. I can give many examples of that, but I'll just sort of focus on one. As I said before, I've studied mostly Hinduism and Buddhism, and I would say that what always appealed to me mostly in those religious traditions was how these traditions have developed a very sophisticated understanding of how our mind works and how to control our mind. So in studying those religions and practicing with them, I feel sometimes like I am more able to understand what it means in the Christian tradition to say that we have to die to ourselves and be reborn in Christ. I mean, all of the things Jesus calls us to do in Matthew chapter 5, for example, to be holy, and the kind of purity of soul and mind that Jesus calls us to is a kind of expectation that I have for most of my life not quite known how to live up to, based only on rituals and practices in my own tradition. And in understanding more about those religious traditions, I have come to understand more about how greed works, how greed and attachment and the ego and all these things that are in the way of living up to the highest ideals of Christianity, by studying those religions and their understanding of the mind and the practices to overcome those self-centered desires. That has all, I would say, helped me in hopefully being a better Christian, or at least helped me to somehow live up to the ideals of Christianity a little bit more. But that's just one example. I mean, in the Jewish tradition, I have the same envy for Sabbath. When I was in Jerusalem celebrating Sabbath with my friends, at the end of Sabbath, they passed this, I forgot the name of the container with sweet-smelling herbs. And that's sort of a consolation because at the end of Sabbath, the soul, the extra soul that comes to celebrate Sabbath with you goes away, and Jewish people are so sad that they need that kind of consolation. How beautiful is that? You know, these are all kind of aspects of other religious traditions that we can taste and maybe bring back some of them to our own religious traditions so as to help them grow and enrich them in that way.
Thank you.
How do we best assess our own empathetic progress? There are people who have seen scenarios happening to another. They look at that scenario and they say, oh, I feel this sympathy. But when they learn more about the circumstance, they realize that the sympathy was completely mismatched. It wasn't at all what was going on. I know that we can ask other people whether we're getting it right, and they can tell us, but aside from doing that, how does a person assess one's own progress in the direction of empathy?
That's a good question. I don't know exactly how to answer that in general. I think what you're saying is probably the only thing that's available to us. On the other hand, I would say empathy doesn't necessarily always have to be a duplication of the experience of the other. And that's sort of what I was trying to say with interreligious empathy, that just the attempt to broaden my experiential horizon, even if it's not exactly the experience of the other, but even if it's only my experience of the other, sometimes can break open something where I understand something new about God. You know, it may not be exactly the same as what the other understands, but maybe that doesn't matter. So I think the very attempt at trying to understand the other and entering into their world can give me something new. On the other hand, I think if it's really a matter of understanding the other, I really think that all we have is a verification of our empathic resonance with somebody belonging to that tradition. But as I said before, one person may say, yes, that's exactly what I experienced, and another person in the same tradition may say, I've never experienced that. So that's a bit of the problem also with interreligious empathy, that there's such variety within religious tradition that who do I check with? So in the end, I think in interreligious dialogue, empathy is, as I said, just a matter of trying to open up my mind and my heart for what might be going on in the other religious tradition, out of respect for the other, and also with the hope that I will learn something new.
I see. Thank you.